Gunpowder smells like burned tin and bad decisions. Sadie didn't jump in front of Beatrice Hayes because she harbored some secret hero complex. Heroes are idiots. She moved because a stray drop of hot tea scalded her wrist. She shifted her weight instinctively, and then the air tore open. 5 rounds. They hit like sledgehammers. No stinging, just blunt, suffocating force. Now the city's most untouchable syndicate boss owes his mother's life to a chronically underpaid physical therapist, and he hates it. Tuesday mornings always tasted like chalk and cheap peppermint. Sadie chewed on a piece of gum that had lost its flavor an hour ago, adjusting the resistance bands around Beatrice's left ankle. "Push against my hand, Mrs. Hayes. Come on, don't let me win." Beatrice scowled her wrinkled face, pulling tight over sharp, aristocratic cheekbones. She smelled of expensive lavender water and mothballs, a scent that clung to the heavy silk of her blouse. "You're a tyrant, Sadie. A poorly compensated tyrant with terrible taste in footwear." Sadie glanced down at her scuffed orthotic sneakers and offered a dry, empty smile. "These shoes save my spine, Beatrice. Push." They were in the private conservatory of a sprawling estate just outside city limits. It was a glass-walled monument to wealth filled with orchids that required more maintenance than Sadie's entire apartment building. Sadie didn't care about the wealth, the rumors, or the men in dark suits who lingered by the French doors. She cared about the $55 an hour she was getting paid out of pocket to rehabilitate a 70-year-old woman's shattered hip. Beatrice finally pushed. The old woman's leg trembled, a frail, vibrating tension against Sadie's calloused palm. "Good. Hold it," Sadie instructed her voice, dropping into the soothing, monotonous cadence she used for every client. She leaned back on her heels, feeling the familiar dull ache in her lower lumbar region. She was 28, but her joints felt like they belonged to someone twice her age. Through the glass, the sky was the color of a bruised, plum-threatening rain. Sadie let her mind wander to the leftover pasta sitting in her fridge, calculating if she had enough milk left for morning coffee. It was mundane. It was normal. Until the glass exploded. It didn't shatter gracefully. It pulverized. A deafening, concussive boom sucked the air right out of Sadie's lungs, replacing it with the sharp metallic tang of dust and ozone. Sadie didn't process the sound of gunfire. Her brain simply registered a sudden violent change in atmospheric pressure. A ceramic pot holding a prized moth orchid violently disintegrated 3 feet away, spraying damp soil and white petals across the terracotta tiles. Beatrice screamed a thin, reedy sound that barely carried over the sudden roar of shattering pains. Sadie's reaction wasn't a calculated dive of martyrdom. She was kneeling off balance. Her hand was still clamped around Beatrice's ankle. When the second volley of shots shattered the glass directly behind them, Beatrice jerked in panic, knocking a heavy silver tea tray off the side table. The scalding Darjeeling splashed directly onto Sadie's exposed forearm. Sadie flinched hard, throwing her weight sideways to escape the burning liquid. She twisted, pulling herself up and over Beatrice's seated form just as the gunmen adjusted their aim. The first bullet took her in the right shoulder. It didn't feel like a piercing. It felt like someone had swung a baseball bat into her clavicle. The sheer kinetic energy spun her around. The second and third hit her ribs, tearing through the cheap cotton of her scrubs. The air vanished from her lungs. She couldn't draw a breath. She couldn't scream. She was falling gravity, pulling her down onto the terrified old woman beneath her. The fourth bullet grazed her hip, leaving a hot, searing trail of fire. The fifth found its home deep in her lower abdomen. Sadie hit the floor hard, her chin cracking against the edge of a mahogany side table. Dust settled over them like dirty snow. The ringing in her ears was absolute, a high-pitched mechanical whine that drowned out the shouting men, the returning fire, the chaos erupting in the conservatory. She lay half-draped over Beatrice. The terracotta tiles were shockingly cold against her cheek. Sadie opened her eyes, her vision swimming in a sea of grey static. She wasn't thinking about her life flashing before her eyes. She wasn't thinking about God or purpose or sacrifice. She was looking at a single crushed orchid petal near her nose. She thought with a bizarre, profound clarity, I definitely left the bathroom sink running. Something wet and impossibly warm was soaking through her shirt, pooling against her stomach. It smelled like raw iron and pennies. Sadie girl, look at me. Beatrice's voice was a panicked hiss, her manicured hands hovering over Sadie's back, but too afraid to touch. Sadie tried to speak, to tell the old woman to shut up and stay down, but when she opened her mouth, a thick, metallic bubble formed on her lips and burst. She gagged a pathetic, wet sound. Every nerve ending in her torso suddenly woke up from the shock, screaming in a choir of white-hot agony. Heavy boots pounded against the ruined floor. Someone was shouting in a language she didn't understand. A shadow fell over her. Not a gunman. The scent of rain, cold tobacco, and expensive cologne cut through the smell of gunpowder. A man dropped to his knees beside her. Large hands, remarkably steady, pressed down hard against her abdomen. Sadie let out a ragged, strangled shriek as the pressure hit the gunshot wound. She tried to thrash, to push him away, but her arms wouldn't obey. "Keep her still," a deep, rough voice commanded. It wasn't directed at her. It was a bark of authority. Gideon Beatrice sobbed, the tough exterior finally cracking. She shielded me. She stepped right in front of them. Sadie wanted to correct her. She wanted to say it was the tea. It was the stupid, burning tea. But the edges of her vision were turning black, curling inward like burning paper. The heavy hands pressed harder against her torn flesh, trying to trap the life leaking out of her. Sadie let her eyes roll back, surrendering to the quiet, suffocating dark. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It seeped in slowly like dirty water rising in a basement. First came the smell. Bleach, heavily starched linen, and the faint, unmistakable odor of stale floral arrangements. Then came the sound. The rhythmic electronic chirp of a heart monitor pulsing in time with the throbbing behind her eyeballs. Finally the pain. It wasn't a sharp ache. It was a dense, heavy presence sitting on her chest, wrapping around her ribs like bands of rusted iron. Every shallow breath felt like dragging sandpaper across her lungs. Sadie tried to swallow, but her throat was desert-dry, raw, and inflamed from a tube that had since been removed. She forced her eyelids open. The fluorescent lights overhead were offensively bright, sending a spike of nausea straight to her stomach. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the room to stop spinning. When she opened them again, the blurry shapes coalesced into a sterile, high-end, private hospital suite. Leather chairs, muted beige walls, a terrifying array of IV bags dripping clear fluids into the crook of her arm, and a man sitting in the corner. He wasn't reading. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was just watching her. Sadie turned her head an inch, wincing as the muscles in her neck protested. Gideon Hayes looked like violence, dressed in bespoke Italian wool. He had the kind of face that belonged on a Roman coin, harsh angles, a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble, and eyes the color of wet flint. He was entirely still, exuding a predatory calmness that made the hair on Sadie's arms stand up. "You're awake," he said. His voice was the same one from the conservatory, deep rough, scraping against the quiet room. Sadie stared at him. She wanted a glass of water. She wanted a heavy dose of morphine. She did not want to deal with a man who looked like he calculated human lives in ledger columns. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. "Ice." Gideon didn't summon a nurse. He stood up slowly, walked over to a small pitcher on the bedside table, and poured water over a cup of crushed ice. He picked up a small plastic spoon, scooped up a few shards, and brought it to her lips. Sadie recoiled, slightly mistrust flaring in her chest. "Take it," he said, his tone devoid of warmth, but carrying a strange, heavy patience. She parted her dry lips and let him tip the ice onto her tongue. The cold relief was agonizingly good. She swallowed, coughing weakly. The cough sent a shockwave of agony through her stitched abdomen, and she squeezed her eyes shut, a pathetic whine escaping her teeth. Gideon pulled his hand back, setting the cup down. He leaned his hip against the edge of her bed, crossing his arms. "5, he said quietly. "You took 5 rounds. 1 collapsed your right lung. 2 broke ribs. 1 grazed your hip. The last one caused internal bleeding that took 3 surgeons 6 hours to stop." Sadie looked at him, her breathing shallow. She felt violated, not just by the bullets, but by this stranger casually reciting the inventory of her broken body. "Am I—" She had to stop to swallow. "Am I paralyzed?" "No," Gideon said flatly. "You'll walk, eventually. It will hurt for a long time." Sadie let her head fall back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling tiles. 5 bullets. The medical bills flashed behind her eyes like a neon sign of doom. Her insurance had a $5,000 deductible. She didn't even have $500 in her checking account. A dry, breathless laugh bubbled up in her throat, instantly turning into a grimace of pain. "My scrubs," she whispered. Gideon frowned a minute, tightening of his jaw. "What? My scrubs? They were new. And my shoes." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes glassy, with leftover anesthesia and raw exhaustion. "Did they cut off my shoes?" Gideon stared at her. He looked genuinely thrown, the cold mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "You nearly bled out on my mother's floor, and you're asking about your orthopedic sneakers. They cost $120, Sadie rasped, deadpan. "I need them to work." "You aren't working," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, tightening with an authority she immediately despised. "You aren't doing anything for the next 6 months, except healing. Who's paying my rent?" She shot back, the anger giving her a tiny burst of adrenaline. It faded quickly, leaving her dizzy. "You don't be stupid." Gideon reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope and dropped it onto the tray table hovering over her legs. "Everything is paid," he said, his tone turning transactional. Comforting territory for a man like him. "The hospital, the surgeons. Your apartment lease has been bought out for the year. There is a bank draft in that envelope for $200,000. Consider it compensation for your bravery." Sadie stared at the envelope. It looked heavy. It looked like blood money. She didn't feel brave. She felt like an idiot who couldn't handle hot tea. She looked back up at Gideon. His eyes were hard, calculating. He was paying off a debt. To a man who dealt in favors and leverage, owing his mother's life to a nobody was a vulnerability. He was buying his way out of gratitude. "I didn't do it on purpose," Sadie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon paused. "What?" "I didn't jump in front of her." Sadie swallowed hard, the truth, tasting bitter but necessary. She knocked over the tea. It burned my arm. I flinched. I tripped. The bullets just got in the way. She expected him to laugh, to snatch the envelope back. Instead, Gideon went entirely still. He stared at her for a long, suffocating minute. The rhythmic hum of the monitors seemed to grow louder. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the transactional coldness. "My mother saw you move. She believes what she believes." Gideon leaned in slightly, the scent of rain and dark tobacco washing over her again. "Take the money, Sadie. Take it and disappear." Because the men who fired those shots now know your face, and they don't care if you tripped. Days blurred into a medicated soup. The private hospital suite, initially a terrifying luxury, quickly became a gilded cage that smelled of iodine and overcooked chicken broth. Sadie's world shrank to the dimensions of her mattress. Her existence was measured in milligrams of oxycodone and the agonizing slow drag of the clock hands. She didn't touch the cream-colored envelope. It sat on the rolling tray table, a heavy paper weight, holding down a stack of discharge pamphlets she hadn't bothered to read. $200,000. It was enough money to change her life, yet right now it couldn't buy her a single deep breath without sending a shockwave of agony through her ribs. Her mind, usually sharp and pragmatic, felt wrapped in dirty gauze. She kept thinking about her apartment. She had left a half-empty mug of coffee on the counter. Her fern needed watering. Her cheap, squeaky mailbox was probably overflowing with bills she couldn't pay. It was a small, pathetic life, but it was hers. Gideon Hayes was trying to buy it with a cashier's check. On the fifth night, the rhythm of the ward shifted. Sadie was a light sleeper, a habit formed from years of living above a 24-hour bodega. The heavy oak door of her room clicked open. It wasn't the brisk, confident push of Nurse Chapel, the night shift matron who smelled of peppermint and aggressively strong hand sanitizer. The hinges gave a barely perceptible groan. Footsteps crossed the threshold. They were too quiet. Sadie cracked one eye open, the street lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. A man in light blue scrubs stood near the foot of her bed. He was holding a clipboard, but his eyes weren't on the paper. They were fixed on the steady rise and fall of her chest. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Sadie's veins. It bypassed the painkillers entirely. She noticed his shoes first. Working in physical therapy, you always looked at the feet. Healthcare workers wore clogs, sturdy sneakers, anything that supported the arch for 12-hour shifts. This man was wearing black, slip-on loafers with a thin leather sole. Quiet shoes. Street shoes. He took a step closer, reaching into the pocket of his scrubs. He wasn't pulling out a stethoscope. Sadie couldn't scream. Her lungs wouldn't expand enough to pull in the air. She threw her left arm out, knocking the heavy plastic water pitcher off the bedside table. It hit the floor with a hollow, echoing crack, splashing crushed ice and water across the tiles. The man lunged. He didn't make it to the bed. A shadow detached itself from the dark corner near the bathroom door. A heavy, sickening crunch of bone-meeting cartilage echoed through the room. The man in the scrubs collapsed, choking on his own blood, pinned to the wet floor by a massive figure in a tailored suit. Gideon's bodyguard. Sadie didn't know his name. She had only seen him lurking in the hallway, a silent, broad-shouldered wall of muscle. The door flew open. More men flooded in. Then Gideon. He wasn't wearing a tie, and the top two buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a dusting of dark hair. He looked tired, the harsh angles of his face cast in grim relief by the hallway light. He didn't look at the bleeding man on the floor. He looked straight at Sadie. Her heart monitor was screaming a rapid, panicked staccato. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "Get him out of here." Gideon ordered, his voice dangerously low. "Find out how he got the uniform, then get rid of him." The intruder was dragged out by his collar, leaving a smear of red across the pristine white tiles. Gideon walked over to the bed. He reached out and hit the silence button on the monitor. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by Sadie's ragged, whistling breaths. "I told you," Gideon said, pulling a chair closer and sitting down. He leaned his forearms on his knees, his presence dominating the cramped space between the bed and the wall. "They don't care if you tripped." "Who?" Sadie swallowed her throat, tasting like copper. "Who was that?" "A mistake," Gideon replied flatly. One that won't happen again. We're leaving." "I can't leave," she protested, her voice weak. "I have a tube in my side. I can't even sit up without wanting to vomit." "You'll vomit in the car, then." He stood his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "This hospital is compromised. My mother is already at the estate. You're going to a secondary location. A safe house." Sadie gripped the thin hospital blanket, her knuckles turning white. No, I am not joining your little mobster protection program. Give me the money. I'll go to Ohio. I have a cousin in Ohio." Gideon actually laughed, a short, dark sound, completely devoid of humor. "You wouldn't make it past the state line. These people aren't street thugs, Sadie. They are methodical. You embarrassed them. You cost them a high-value target. They will peel you apart just to send a message to me." He leaned over her, his hands gripping the metal rails of the bed. The scent of cold rain and expensive tobacco surrounded her, suffocating and strangely grounding. "You don't have a life to go back to anymore," he said softly, the harsh truth cutting through the last of her denial. "Your apartment was broken into 3 hours ago. Your cousin in Ohio just got a visit from 2 men asking about your whereabouts. You belong to this mess now. Let's go." Waking up in a bed that cost more than a luxury sedan did not make the pain any more tolerable. In fact, the aggressive softness of the Egyptian cotton sheets only highlighted how broken Sadie's body felt. She lay staring at a coffered ceiling that belonged in an architectural digest, listening to the relentless drumming of rain against the reinforced glass windows. It had been 4 days since the extraction from the hospital. The safe house wasn't a bunker. It was a sprawling, secluded, mid-century modern fortress perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-end tomb. Sadie gritted her teeth and initiated the brutal process of sitting up. Her physical therapy background was both a blessing and a curse. She knew exactly what her muscles were doing. She understood the biomechanics of her torn abdominal wall, the fragile knitting bones in her ribs, the scar tissue that was already forming, threatening to lock her joints in place if she didn't move. Ignorance would have been bliss. Instead, she had to act as her own torturer. She rolled onto her left side, suppressing a whimper as the stitches pulled tight. She used her good arm to push her torso up, letting her legs swing off the side of the mattress. Sweat broke out across her forehead, cold and clammy. Just sitting upright made her feel like she had run a marathon while breathing through a straw. The heavy oak door opened. Gideon walked in, carrying a silver tray. He paused, taking in the sight of her. Sadie was hunched over her face, pale, dressed in an oversized grey t-shirt that hung off her diminishing frame. She looked fragile, a stiff breeze away from shattering. "You're supposed to ring the bell for the nurse," he said, walking to the small table by the window and setting the tray down. "I don't want the nurse." Sadie bit out her voice, raspy. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Manage the pain, don't let it manage you. "She treats me like a toddler. I need to move." "You took 5 bullets 3 weeks ago," Gideon countered, pouring black coffee from a sleek thermal carafe. "You aren't Rocky. Lie back down." Sadie glared at him. He looked immaculate, as always. A dark charcoal suit, no tie, looking utterly relaxed in an environment built for paranoia. It infuriated her. "If I don't move," she explained, her voice tight with exertion, "the fascia around the trauma sites will bind. The scar tissue will become inelastic. If I let myself turn into a statue, I'll never walk right again. I know my job, Hayes." Gideon picked up a cup of coffee and walked toward her. He didn't hand it to her. He just stood there, watching her tremble with the effort of holding herself upright. "You're a very stubborn woman," he observed. It wasn't a compliment. It was a clinical assessment, And you're a mob boss playing nursemaid. We both have our quirks. Sadie finally reached out her hand, shaking slightly, and took the coffee. The mug was warm, a small comfort against her cold palms. Why are you here? Don't you have illegal things to do? Extortion, racketeering. Gideon's jaw tightened, a subtle shift in the muscles beneath his skin. My business is running just fine. I'm here because my mother insisted I check on the woman who saved her life. She sent soup. He gestured toward the tray. It smells terrible. Sadie actually smiled, a small, broken thing that barely reached her eyes. Beatrice's cook uses too much time. I used to tell her that during our sessions. For a fraction of a second, the heavy, oppressive air in the room shifted. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, and Sadie felt a strange jolt in her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. It was the sudden realization that beneath the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation, he was just a man who was deeply, uncomfortably out of his depth. He didn't know how to handle someone he couldn't intimidate or buy. I brought the envelope, Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave. He pulled the cream-colored parchment from his inner jacket pocket and tossed it onto the bed beside her thigh. You refused it at the hospital. I'm leaving it here. Sadie stared at the envelope. I told you. I don't want it. It's not a negotiation, Sadie. You have no apartment. You have no job. You have medical bills that will require specialized care for the next year. You will need physical therapy, which, despite your current display of masochism, you cannot do yourself. He stepped closer, invading her space. The smell of him, leather rain, that sharp, masculine soap made her head spin. You took bullets meant for my blood, Gideon said, his eyes locking onto hers. They were dark, intense, stripped of all polite pretense. In my world, a debt like that isn't erased with a thank you. It's a weight. I don't like carrying weight. Sadie looked up at him, refusing to shrink back. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she held her ground. So this is about your conscience. You pay me off and you get to sleep at night. I sleep fine. He lied smoothly. Take the money. Buy back your life when this is over. And when is it over? She asked, her voice cracking. The cynical armor she wore was incredibly heavy today. When do the people who shot me stop looking? Gideon looked away, staring out the window at the grey, churning ocean. The silence stretched tight and uncomfortable. When he finally looked back at her, the predatory calmness was gone, replaced by something much colder. Something fatal. When I kill every single one of them, he said. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Sadie sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting against her leg, the cold coffee in her hands, entirely alone in a house built by blood. Recovery is rarely a linear incline. It is a jagged, humiliating series of small failures. By her 8th day at the cliffside estate, Sadie felt like she was losing her mind. The rain hadn't stopped. It battered the floor-to-ceiling windows, a relentless drumming reminder of her isolation. The envelope containing $200,000 remained on the nightstand, untouched, gathering a fine layer of dust. She was alone for most of the day. A silent, terrifyingly efficient housekeeper brought her meals. A nurse named Thomas came by twice to change her dressings, his bedside manner as sterile as his iodine swabs. Gideon was a ghost. She heard the low rumble of his voice in the hallway, sometimes the heavy tread of his boots, the slam of a car door in the driveway. He was out there dismantling whoever had dared to shoot up his mother's conservatory. Sadie just wanted to use the bathroom without feeling like her torso was being ripped open by a dull spoon. It was mid-afternoon. The shadows in her room were long and grey. She sat on the edge of the mattress, waiting for the latest dose of Tylenol. She had refused the heavy narcotics 2 days ago, hating the thick, suffocating fog they put over her brain to take the edge off. 10 feet. That was the distance to the ensuite bathroom. She gripped the heavy mahogany bedpost, her knuckles turning white. She pushed up. Her right leg took her weight perfectly, her left leg compensating for the severed muscle fibers in her abdomen, buckled instantly. A sharp, electric jolt of agony shot from her hip to her collarbone. Sadie gasped, grabbing at empty air. Her fingers grazed the edge of the nightstand, knocking the cream envelope to the floor before her knees hit the hardwood. She landed hard. The impact jarred her broken ribs. A ragged animal sound tore out of her throat. It wasn't a scream. It was a pathetic, wet sob of pure frustration. She curled onto her side, clutching her stomach, her forehead resting against the cold, polished oak floorboards. She couldn't breathe. The air was trapped behind a wall of white-hot pain. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. The door handle turned, the heavy wood swinging inward with enough force to bang against the wall. Gideon stopped in the doorway. He was wearing a dark Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, exposing thick forearms dusted with dark hair and pale, faded scars. He held a phone in his left hand, his thumb hovering over the screen. He took one look at her crumpled on the floor and shoved the phone into his pocket. "Don't," Sadie wheezed, throwing a trembling hand up as he crossed the room. "Don't touch me." He ignored her completely. He dropped to one knee beside her, his large hands hovering over her back, assessing the angle of her body. He smelled like stale, coffee-wet asphalt and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. It wasn't a subtle scent. It clung to him like a second skin. "Did you tear the stitches?" His voice was a harsh, clipped demand. "No." She squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears leaking out against her will. They were tears of rage, not sorrow. My leg gave out. It's the fascia. It's tight." "You're an idiot," he said softly. It wasn't an insult. It sounded more like a grim fact. "You have a call button right next to your head." "I don't want an audience every time I need to pee, Hayes. So you prefer crawling on my floor?" He didn't wait for an answer. He slid one arm under her knees and the other around her shoulders, deliberately avoiding her ribs and the bandaged side of her abdomen. "Brace," he ordered. Sadie clamped her jaw shut. He lifted her. It hurt. Even with his care, gravity shifted, her organs pulling at the damaged tissue. She buried her face into the crook of his neck, stifling a whine against his collarbone. His skin was warm. The muscle beneath his shirt was hard, unyielding like stone. He carried her the 10 feet to the bathroom and set her down gently on the closed lid of the toilet. He didn't immediately step back. He stayed close, his hands gripping her upper arms to ensure she had her balance. Sadie kept her head down, staring at his dark leather boots. Her chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. She felt utterly exposed, stripped of every defense she usually kept so carefully constructed. "I hate this," she whispered the words scraping out of her dry throat. "I hate being helpless. I hate your money. I hate that I can't even stand up in this stupid, massive house." Gideon's grip on her arms shifted. He let go of her left arm and reached up his rough knuckles, brushing against her jaw. He tipped her head up. His eyes were a storm grey, entirely devoid of pity. That was the one thing she appreciated. He didn't look at her like a broken bird. He looked at her like a problem that required solving. "You aren't helpless," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rumble. "You took 5 rounds from professional hitters, and you're fighting me about taking a painkiller. You're stubborn. You're inconvenient." He dropped his hand, taking a half step back. "But you aren't helpless. Do what you need to do. I'll wait outside the door to carry you back." He turned and walked out, pulling the bathroom door almost completely shut behind him. Sadie sat on the toilet lid, staring at the sliver of light coming through the crack in the door. Her side throbbed. Her face was sticky with dried tears. But for the first time since she woke up in the hospital, the crushing weight of panic in her chest receded just a fraction. It was 3:14 a.m. Sadie knew this because the digital clock on the bedside table was offensively bright, casting a red glare across the empty bedroom. The pain was a dull, constant ache tonight, manageable but deeply annoying. It was the thirst that drove her out of bed. The pitcher on her table was empty. She could have pressed the button for Thomas, but the thought of the man's silent, judging stare was worse than the physical effort of walking. She managed the stairs this time. It took her 10 minutes to descend the long, sweeping staircase, leaning heavily on the glass balustrade, taking one agonizing step at a time. Her oversized t-shirt swallowed her frame, the hem brushing against her bare knees. The house was cavernous and silent. Only the soft amber glow of the security lights illuminated the hallway leading to the kitchen. Sadie pushed open the heavy swinging door. The kitchen was a stark, industrial space, built for a professional catering crew. Stainless steel countertops, a massive 10-burner gas range. In the center of the room, standing at the deep basin sink, was Gideon. He didn't jump when the door clicked shut behind her. Men like him rarely startled. He was out of his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, the cuffs rolled up past his elbows. A dark leather shoulder holster rested on the marble island, the heavy matte black grip of a handgun clearly visible. Sadie froze just inside the doorway. Gideon had the water running full blast. He was scrubbing his hands with a stiff, bristled vegetable brush and a pump of harsh dish soap. The water spiraling down the stainless steel drain was a pale, cloudy pink. The air in the kitchen smelled sharply of copper and bleach. It was a smell Sadie knew well from the trauma wards during her clinical rotations. Fresh blood. Gideon turned the water off. He grabbed a roll of paper towels, ripping off a long section, and finally turned to look at her. He looked exhausted. The harsh lines of his face were drawn tight, dark circles, bruising the skin under his eyes. There was a small, dark smear on his jawline that he had missed. "You shouldn't be on the stairs," he said. His voice lacked its usual commanding edge. It sounded hollowed out. "I was thirsty." Sadie didn't move. Her eyes darted from the pink residue in the sink to the holster on the island, and finally to his knuckles. The skin on his right hand was split and raw over the knuckles, angry and swollen. "There's bottled water in the fridge." He tossed the crumpled paper towels into the trash. Sadie forced her feet to move. She didn't run back upstairs. She walked slowly to the massive refrigerator, pulled out a cold bottle, and set it on the counter. She didn't open it. She turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. "Did you find them?" she asked. The question hung in the quiet kitchen, heavy and dangerous. Gideon leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't look away. He didn't offer a sanitized version of the truth. "I found the men who pulled the triggers," he said, his tone flat, devoid of triumph or regret. "I found the man who paid them. I found the middleman who procured the weapons. And they are no longer a concern." Sadie swallowed hard. The water in her throat felt like sand. She was standing in a kitchen with a man who had just systematically murdered multiple people. She should be terrified. She should be demanding a phone to call the police. Instead, she felt a sick, twisted sense of relief. She walked over to the freezer drawer. She pulled it open, grabbed a clean dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and scooped a handful of crushed ice into the center of the fabric. She twisted the ends together, making a makeshift ice pack. She walked over to where Gideon was leaning against the counter. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out, caught his right wrist, and pressed the ice pack firmly against his torn, bloody knuckles. Gideon flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. His muscles tensed, ready to pull away, but he stopped himself. He stared down at her hands, holding his. "You're going to get an infection," Sadie muttered, keeping her eyes fixed on his hand, refusing to look up at his face. Dish soap isn't antibacterial, and human bites are filthy. Someone's tooth caught your middle knuckle. "You're icing the hand of a killer," Gideon pointed out softly. "I'm icing a contusion to prevent swelling," Sadie corrected her voice, trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it clinical. "You gave me ice when I woke up. I'm paying off a debt." Gideon let out a low, rough breath. He didn't pull away. He let her hold his hand, the ice melting, slowly dripping cold water onto the stainless steel counter. "The debt is paid." "Sadie," he said quietly, the words meant to be a release, but sounding strangely like a trap. "They won't come looking for you. You can take the money. You can leave." Sadie finally looked up. His face was inches from hers. The smell of copper was fading, replaced by his natural scent, tobacco rain, and exhaustion. "I know," she whispered. But as she stood there, holding the ice against his bruised skin in the quiet, empty house, neither of them made a move to step away. Wednesday morning tasted like stale peppermint and resignation. The torrential rain had finally broken overnight, leaving the cliffside estate bathed in a harsh, unforgiving sunlight that illuminated every speck of dust in Sadie's bedroom. It also illuminated the bathroom mirror. Sadie stood in front of the glass, gripping the edges of the marble vanity until her knuckles turned white. She had just taken off the heavy surgical dressings for the first time without Thomas, the nurse, hovering over her. She looked at her torso. It was a disaster. The entry wound on her shoulder was a puckered, angry starburst of dark pink tissue. The grazing shot on her hip was a long, jagged trench, but the abdomen was the worst. A thick, raised surgical scar bisected her stomach, tracking down past her navel, flanked by the smaller, circular, deep purple indents where the bullets had actually penetrated. Her skin was painted in a sickening palette of yellow and green bruising. She looked like she had been assembled from spare parts in a dark room. A sharp knock broke the silence. Sadie flinched, her left hand instantly flying to cover her stomach, a useless, reflexive gesture to protect her injured core. Just a minute. She pulled an oversized linen shirt off the hook, wincing as the fabric dragged against her overly sensitized skin, and buttoned it up wrong. She shuffled out of the bathroom, relying heavily on her right leg. The door opened. It wasn't Gideon, and it wasn't the silent housekeeper. Beatrice Hayes stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on an ornate, silver-handled cane. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit, a string of pearls, and an expression that suggested she found the entire universe mildly disappointing. She smelled intensely of dried lavender and expensive botanical gin. "You look terrible," Beatrice announced, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Hayes," Sadie rasped, shuffling toward the armchair by the window and collapsing into it with a heavy sigh. Beatrice didn't sit. She paced slowly toward the nightstand, the rubber tip of her cane squeaking faintly against the polished hardwood. She looked down at the cream-colored envelope, still sitting exactly where Gideon had dropped it days ago. "My son tells me you are being difficult," Beatrice said, using the tip of her cane to nudge the envelope. "He says you refuse to leave, but you refuse to take the severance." "It's not severance. I didn't work for him." Sadie leaned her head back against the chair, exhaustion seeping into her bones. "And I'm not being difficult. I'm being realistic. I can't walk down a flight of stairs without needing a nap. Where exactly am I supposed to go?" "Anywhere," Beatrice replied sharply, turning to face her. The old woman's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Paris, the Maldives, a high-end rehabilitation clinic in Switzerland. He gave you enough money to disappear very comfortably." "I don't want to disappear." Sadie's voice cracked. She swallowed the lump of self-pity forming in her throat. "I want my apartment. I want my terrible squeaky orthopedic shoes. I want my life back." Beatrice's expression softened just a fraction. The aristocratic haughtiness chipped away, revealing the tired mother beneath. She walked over and sat on the edge of the mattress, resting her hands on the silver head of her cane. "You don't get that life back, Sadie. You bled on my conservatory floor. You saw the faces of men who slaughter for a paycheck." Beatrice leaned forward, the smell of lavender growing stronger. "But more importantly, you saw Gideon. You saw him panic." Sadie frowned, her brows knitting together. "He didn't panic. He was completely cold. He pressed his bare hands into your open wounds to keep you in this world." Beatrice corrected her voice, dropping to a low, intense whisper. "My son does not touch the dying. He orchestrates death. He does not try to stop it. You broke a rule in his very rigid, very violent world. You made him owe you." "He paid the debt," Sadie argued, gesturing weakly to the envelope. "He killed the men who did it. He said so." Beatrice let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Gideon kills people before breakfast. That isn't payment. That's housekeeping. The envelope is his attempt to put you in a neat little box labeled Transaction Completed. But you won't take it. Because it's blood money. Because you know he doesn't want you to take it," Beatrice said bluntly. Sadie stared at the old woman, her heart doing a strange, a rhythmic stutter against her healing ribs. "That's insane." "Is it?" Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. "If you take the money, the ledger is balanced. The connection is severed. You go back to being a stranger. If you don't take it, he is bound to you. And Gideon Hayes has never been bound to anyone he couldn't control." The heavy oak door swung open again. Gideon stood on the threshold. He wore a dark navy suit today, the jacket unbuttoned. His eyes flicked from his mother to Sadie, registering the tension in the room instantly. "Mother," he said, his tone a warning. "Thomas is waiting downstairs to check your hip." Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her grip on her cane and walked toward the door. As she passed her son, she paused, not looking up at him. "She's too smart for you, Gideon. It's going to be a terrible problem." Beatrice walked out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in her wake. Gideon didn't move from the doorway. He stared at Sadie, his bruised knuckles resting against the wooden doorframe. Sadie looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the man who had torn his own hands apart to avenge a woman he claimed he just wanted to pay off. "I need a laptop," Sadie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I need to look for an apartment. I'm leaving on Friday." Cardboard boxes always smelled like stale glue and misplaced optimism. Sadie sat on the floor of her new living room, her back pressed against the freshly painted drywall, staring at a mountain of brown, corrugated cardboard. It had been 3 weeks since she left the cliffside estate. She hadn't taken the $200,000. She had, however, allowed Gideon to cover the deposit and first 6 months of rent on a mid-range apartment in a neighborhood that felt aggressively normal. It was a compromise that tasted like ashes, but her bank account was overdrawn by $40, and pride couldn't buy groceries. The apartment was on the 4th floor. It had a small balcony overlooking a busy intersection, a galley kitchen with a temperamental refrigerator, and absolutely zero security guards. It was terrifying. Sadie pulled her knees up to her chest, wincing as the scar tissue across her abdomen stretched and pulled tight. The physical therapy was grueling. Without the sterile luxury of the estate, she was doing her exercises on a cheap yoga mat, sweating through t-shirts while gritting her teeth against the lingering ghost-like aches in her bones. The silence of the apartment was the worst part. At the safe house, there was always the distant hum of the ocean, the heavy tread of boots in the hall, the quiet, terrifying presence of a man who commanded the room just by breathing in it. Here there was only the rattle of the radiator and the wail of police sirens down the avenue. Every time a siren screamed past, Sadie's heart rate spiked, her breath hitching in her chest as the metallic tang of gunpowder flooded her sensory memory. PTSD wasn't a cinematic flashback. It was a physical hijacking of her nervous system. She needed coffee. She needed to be out of this suffocating, empty box. Sadie grabbed a heavy wool cardigan, slipping her arms in carefully, and grabbed her keys. She didn't use a cane anymore, but she walked with a pronounced stiff-legged limp, her body instinctively protecting its damaged core. The street level hit her like a physical blow. The smell of exhaust, roasting nuts from a street cart, and damp trash was overwhelming. The sidewalks were packed with people walking too fast, looking at their phones, completely unaware of their surroundings. Sadie walked close to the brick facades of the buildings, her eyes darting to every alleyway, every parked car with tinted windows. She made it 2 blocks to a corner cafe. She ordered a black coffee, clutching the hot paper cup like a talisman, and stepped back out into the chill of the November afternoon. That was when she saw him. He was standing near the entrance of a subway grate, wearing a nondescript grey jacket and a dark beanie. He was reading a free commuter newspaper, completely absorbed in the sports section. But he had been standing by the fire hydrant outside her apartment building 20 minutes ago. Sadie's blood ran cold, then hot, with a sudden violent spike of adrenaline. She didn't run. Her lungs couldn't handle a sprint anyway. She gripped her coffee cup tight enough to dent the cardboard, crossed the street, and walked straight toward the man. He noticed her trajectory when she was 10 feet away. He lowered the newspaper, his hand casually slipping into the deep pocket of his jacket. He didn't look malicious. He looked annoyed. "Tell your boss," Sadie said, her voice shaking, but loud enough to cut through the traffic noise, "that if I see you outside my building again, I'm calling the police. I know what you are." The man blinked perfectly, adopting a mask of mild confusion. "Excuse me, miss, I'm just waiting for a friend." "You're a terrible liar, and your shoes scream tactical wear," Sadie snapped, gesturing to his heavy matte black boots. "Tell Gideon the invisible leash is insulting." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned on her heel, her hip screaming in protest at the sudden pivot, and marched back toward her apartment. She felt a phantom crosshair on her spine the entire way. By the time she locked her apartment door, her hands were shaking so badly she spilled half her coffee on the cheap, laminate entryway floor. She dropped the cup, sinking to her knees, scrubbing at the hot liquid with the sleeve of her cardigan. A knock echoed through the wood of her door. Just one sharp, heavy rap. Sadie froze. The man from the street wouldn't knock. He would pick the lock or wait outside. She forced herself up, leaning heavily against the doorframe, and looked through the peephole. Gideon. He looked out of place in the dingy hallway. He wore a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit, his presence entirely too large, too sharp for the mundane setting. Sadie unbolted the door and pulled it open a few inches. She didn't invite him in. "You pulled your detail," she demanded, her voice hoarse. "He's not a detail, he's an observer." Gideon corrected smoothly, his eyes scanning her pale face, dropping briefly to the coffee stain on her sleeve. He was instructed to stay out of sight. "Well, I saw him. So he's fired." Sadie gripped the edge of the door. "I told you I wanted my life back. Having a mobster reading the sports page on my corner is not my life." Gideon stepped forward. He didn't push the door, but his physical proximity forced Sadie to take a half step back into her apartment. The smell of rain and cold tobacco instantly overwrote the smell of stale glue and spilled coffee. "You walked right up to a man you suspected of tailing you. Gideon said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made her nerve endings hum. You confronted him in broad daylight. Do you have a death wish, Sadie, or are you just aggressively stupid? I'm tired of being scared, she shouted, the raw emotion finally tearing through her cynical facade. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. I left the estate. I left the money. Why won't you just let me go? Gideon stepped fully into the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. He reached out his large, calloused hands, gripping her shoulders. He didn't shake her, but the hold was absolute. Because you belong to the violence now, whether you want to or not, he said, his eyes burning into hers. And because I can't sleep unless I know exactly where you are. Gideon's grip on her shoulders was a vice, not bruising, but completely inescapable. Sadie stared up at him, her chest heaving, the smell of his damp wool coat, mixing with the metallic tang of fear still coating her tongue. She tried to wrench herself free. It was a terrible mistake. The sudden violent twist of her torso tore at the unhealed fascia in her abdomen. A blinding, white-hot spike of pain shot through her core, instantly stealing the air from her lungs. The damaged muscles simply refused to support her weight. Her knees buckled. She didn't swoon. She collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Gideon caught her before she hit the cheap laminate flooring. He swore a harsh, guttural sound that rattled in his chest and scooped her up his hands, instinctively adjusting to avoid putting pressure on her ribs. He carried her the 5 steps into the cramped living area and deposited her onto the faded mustard-yellow sofa she had bought for $50 off the internet. It smelled faintly of cat dander and old, stale smoke. Sadie curled in on herself, immediately gripping her stomach over the thick wool cardigan, gasping for shallow, ragged breaths. The physical agony was bad, but the emotional dam breaking was infinitely worse. She started to cry. It wasn't a delicate, silent weeping. It was an ugly, visceral sobbing that racked her broken frame. Every heave of her chest felt like broken glass grinding against her sternum, which only made her cry harder. The frustration was suffocating. Snot ran down her upper lip. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, humiliated, furious, and utterly, hopelessly shattered. "Stop!" She choked out a pathetic, wet demand aimed at her own failing body. Just stop it. Gideon didn't offer a tissue. He didn't pat her knee and tell her it was going to be okay. Men who built empires on blood didn't deal in cheap comfort. Instead, he shrugged off his overcoat, letting the heavy, wet cashmere drop carelessly to the dirty floor. He sat down on the sagging cushions beside her. The old springs groaned in protest under his weight. He reached out and wrapped his arms around her shaking frame, pulling her awkwardly but firmly against his side. Sadie fought him for exactly 2 seconds. Then the sheer exhaustion won. She buried her face into the crook of his neck, her hot tears soaking into the starched collar of his pristine shirt. He was solid. He was a wall of muscle and heat, an anchor in a room that felt like it was spinning dangerously out of control. His right hand, still rough with healing scabs over split knuckles, came up to cup the back of her head, pressing her closer. "Breathe," he murmured. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. They sat there as the radiator banged and hissed violently in the corner. The noise of the city traffic outside faded into a dull white noise. Sadie cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned like they had sand in them. She cried for the $55 an hour she would never make again. She cried for the ruined orchids. She cried for the terrifying reality that she had traded a boring, safe existence for a life where death loitered on her street corner. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollow and trembling with cold, she didn't pull away. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocatingly intimate. "You ruined my life," she whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. Gideon's jaw rested lightly against the top of her head. He didn't flinch at the accusation. I know. I can't go to the grocery store without looking at people's shoes to see if they're tactical. I drop my coffee when someone knocks on my own front door. She swallowed hard, staring blankly at a water stain on the opposite wall. I'm broken, Hayes. You're not broken. His grip tightened slightly, a physical, rigid denial of her words. You're surviving. Surviving isn't living. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look down at her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her skin splotchy and pale. She looked terrible. But to Gideon, staring down at her, in the dim, terrible lighting of her cheap apartment, she looked like the only real thing in a world constructed entirely of leverage and lies. I tried to pay you to leave, he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her shoulder. I tried to clear the ledger, so I wouldn't have to think about the woman who bled out on my mother's floor. I have spent my entire life avoiding debts I couldn't control. He reached out his thumb, gently wiping a stray half-dried tear from her cheek. The touch was startlingly tender, a jarring contrast to the violence she knew those hands were capable of. But the ledger is broken. He confessed the admission visibly costing him. The mask of the untouchable boss slipped entirely, leaving behind a man who looked exhausted. The observer outside your building wasn't just to protect you. He was there because, if I don't know exactly where you are, if I don't know you're breathing, I tear my own city apart looking for threats. It's not a debt anymore, Sadie. It's a flaw in my system. And you are the flaw. Sadie looked up at him, the cynical voice in her head, warring with the raw, desperate ache in her chest. He wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a shared nightmare, one where they were both trapped by the violence but trapped together. I don't want the envelope, she said, her voice barely a breath over the rattling radiator. I didn't bring it, he replied. He leaned down, closing the remaining distance between them. It wasn't a desperate, hungry kiss. It was slow, tentative, as if he were testing the limits of her fragile ribs. His lips were warm, tasting faintly of black coffee and adrenaline. Sadie closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath, her fingers curling tight into the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't a neat ending. The bullets had left permanent, ugly scars. The men who had pulled the triggers were dead, but the world that created them was still out there, waiting just beyond the thin glass of her fourth-floor window. But as Gideon pulled her closer, his thumb stroking the sharp line of her jaw, the phantom crosshair on her spine finally faded. She was no longer a civilian caught in the crossfire. She was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes surviving the bullets is the easy part. The real danger starts when you realize your quiet, normal life is gone forever, replaced by a debt to a man who destroys everything he touches, except you. Sadie's scars are permanent, but so is Gideon's obsession. If this raw, gritty look at accidental sacrifice and dark romance left you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the money and run or stayed? Share this video, and I'll see you next time.